art. So I have been doing this for about 5 years, and I have no ego problems. I'm used to being the warm up act, and sometimes the warm up act to the warm up act, even, which is sort of what I am tonight because I am not the introducer himself. But this is a unique event because I have never, in all my time here, had to introduce someone who was going to introduce their spouse. And as someone with a background in national security, I have to say that this seems to me to be a remarkably perilous undertaking. I don't know about you, but I would not have my wife introduce me. Ever. Okay, we're gonna see how that all goes. And you're a self-confident fellow. Yeah. Anyway, it's great to have the Evenson family here. We'll see how it all works out. But Kristen will be doing the talking, and she's highly qualified to do so from all kinds of standard objective criteria. But this is a new one, and it's great to have Max here too. And I will confine my remarks first to the background of the fellowship. So the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellowship in Fiction was established in 2007 with the purpose of bringing outstanding novelists and fiction writers to Berlin. It was endowed in perpetuity in 2009. One of the great things about my job is I get to meet some really remarkable people, and the von der Heydens are very, very high on the list in that group. Carl is a native Berliner, a founding trustee of the American Academy, treasurer for over a decade, and co-chairman of the Academy from 2009 to 2011, co-chair of our board. He has done a remarkable oral history of growing up in Berlin during the war. I highly recommend you look it up. He and his wife, Mary Ellen, who is a fantastic reader herself, have long been committed to philanthropy, and they have funded, just at their common alma mater of Duke University, a library and arts center, a number of fellowships, and a big pavilion, I believe. They've also made significant endowments elsewhere at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, and they are just great literary people. And the fellowship recognizes Mary Ellen's lifelong passion for fiction, and this fellowship has a really distinguished history, and it has, among the incumbents have been Laurie Moore, Jonathan Lethem, Samantha Chang, and now Brian Evenson, who we're really honored to have as our fellow this semester. So I'm introducing the introducer, as I told you, and let me just say a few words about Kristen Tracy. She has, as I said, all the objective qualifications to do this. She has an MA in American Literature, an MFA in Poetry, and a PhD in English. I'm not talking about the familial relations, just the degrees. Her poetry manuscript, Haphazard, won the very prestigious Emily Dickinson First Book Award from the Poetry Foundation. It was praised by, among others, Claudia Rankine, a very distinguished former fellow who was supposed to be here tonight, but the world being what it is and visa issues being what they are, could not be here and had to go back to New York City. Kristen's poems have appeared in literary journals such as The New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, and the Southern Review. She was the co-editor of the University of Iowa Press's volume, A Chorus for Peace, a global anthology of poetry by women. She writes board books, picture books, young adult, middle grade novels, and young adult books. And these include the unofficial Alcatraz Handbook. The picture's coming together here. A complete guide to Alcatraz that, despite being written for middle grade readers, is now widely considered the most accurate book on Alcatraz out there. If Germans don't know Alcatraz, famous prison in the middle of the water. Anyway, a picture book based on her cat who once ran away, which Kristen perceived as a form of quitting her house because she had too many rules. She wrote a book about that. It's called I Quit. She is working on a book about U-boats, and a picture book about two exceptional barn owls who work as foster parents to orphaned owls. You're a very productive family. At one time in her life, she was a college professor and an aerobics instructor, and I'd love to know which was more of a workout. And at another time, she was a volunteer gardener in Alcatraz and an aspiring bird docent. The family makes their home in Los Angeles, and as I mentioned, she's married to Brian, mother of Max. And I'm authoritatively told by my staff, if you ever go hiking with Kristen, be careful. She attracts injured birds, apex predators, and large non-venomous snakes. Well, at least they're non-venomous. Anyway, just a little bit of housekeeping. Brian, I don't know how long Kristen's going to go on for, but Brian's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then there will be Q&A. And if you are here, just raise your hand in the traditional way. And if you're joining us via Vimeo, please type your question in the Q&A part of the platform. It's over to you now. Be kind.
Hello, I'm Kristen, and before I start, I really do want to just say thank you. This has been such a nourishing and joyful and welcoming place, and also an alternative to a place where we could otherwise be right now. So once I get going, this is going to be a little quick, so I just want to make sure that this reference I make is clear. R.L. Stine is an American writer famous for writing a horror series for children called Goosebumps that sold over 400 million copies. When the references come, they might be a little bit quick. So I just want to make sure we all know what that one is. Okay. It's my job to introduce Brian Evenson, and he's deep and complex and has lots of layers. So just like his writing, let's get going. Blurbs. There is not a more intense, prolific, or apocalyptic writer of fiction in America than Brian Evenson, George Saunders. You've heard of postmodern stories. Well, Evenson's stories are post-everything. They are post-human, post-reason, post-apocalyptic. And in Evenson's story, there are two horrible things that can happen to you. You can either fail to survive or survive. The New York Times. Evenson's fiction is equal parts obsessive, experimental, and violent. It can be soul-shaking. The New Yorker. His stories are deeply terrifying and so troubling that they linger in your mind long after you've read them. R.L. Stine. Let's go ahead now and turn to Twitter for some Brian Evenson feedback. At Face You Hate, October 2024. I don't want to be a dick about this, but I don't think trying to get Goosebumps fans on board with Brian Evenson is the best use of anyone's marketing dollar. At Brian Birch, February 2025, the acknowledgements pages of Brian Evenson's collections are wild. It's like Conjunctions, a couple university journals you've heard of, a handful of horror mags, and like a limited edition broadside randomly folded into 99 2017 Ford Fusion user manual booklets. And in response to that, I think often about the stories originally published in Jake the Pike's World of Wrestling. At which point I confronted Brian and said, "What is that?" And he said, "A place where some of my first stories appeared." Brian is often sought after for interviews and podcasts, and he might not be aware of this, but I read those and listen to them. So one of my favorite interviews that he gave was with J.W. McCormack. There are at least 3 Brian Evensons, all of them exceedingly improbable. First, there's Brian Evenson, the prolific author of crisp, often disturbing novels and short stories, whose first collection, Altman's Tongue, famously scandalized his employers at Brigham Young University and led to his resignation from the Mormon Church. By the way, these are all my photos. Then there's B.K. Evenson, the sci-fi novelist behind books set in the Aliens and Dead Space universes and co-writer of the novelization of Rob Zombie's film, The Lord of Salem. Finally, there's Brian Evenson, the translator of prestigious French fiction, including the charming and deeply strange novella In the Time of the Blue Ball, a book ascribed to Manuela Draeger, who does not exist. Brian writes many different types of things. He writes novels, novellas, short stories. He now writes for TV and movies. He strikes for TV and movies. He's been awarded many things, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA grant, the O. Henry Award, the International Horror Guild Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, the American Library Association Prize for Best Horror Novel, the World Fantasy Award, and he's been a finalist for the Edgar Award. He's also a translator, and his work has been translated into French, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Italian, Chinese, Korean, Polish, Arabic, Czech, Russian, Japanese, Persian, Turkish, and that's 14 languages. Here Brian is with Antoine Volodine and his wife Anne and Max, who he has translated. And he's also pictured here with Claro, who I've been told is like Cher and only has one name. Brian sold his literary archives to Yale's Beinecke Museum. Brian and I, between us, have zero photos documenting any of this. Here is his archivist, Gerald Cloud, drinking with Max in Paris. Brian built this shed from a box shipped from Costco that weighed 2,000 pounds. Brian shovels his own driveway. Brian helps friends put up hay. 3 years after this photo was taken, Brian sang soprano in the Honolulu Boys Choir. I mean this in a good way. Brian is a lot. He's a bust. He's an action figure. He's a puzzle, which makes sense because he loves to assemble intricate wooden puzzles. He only assembles them once. He's intermittently a member of a puzzle club where puzzles are sent to him by mail. Brian notices animals everywhere, usually first. These horses are actually napping in the warm sand, but we didn't know that at first. We had to track somebody down and ask and make sure. What's interesting here is he notices the horses with me in May 2012. He publishes a story, Collapse of Horses, in March 2013. He publishes the full collection in 2016. So image precedes word, but with Brian, not by much. More about Brian. He spent the night in a cell on Alcatraz and a room in a castle. Brian holds animals tenderly. Praised by Peter Straub for going furthest out on the sheerest, least sheltered narrative precipice, here's our last meeting with Peter pretending to strangle Max. Brian could spend the rest of his life meeting his friends for coffee, lunch, and dinner, and a significant chunk of which would be spent in Brooklyn. Ooh. Brian can be wrong. When he asked if I wanted to take baby Max to the beach, I said sure. When beach access turned out to be closed, Brian assured me we could still get there. The optimism with which Brian carries the stroller over the huge boulders at the ocean, that was intense. Brian's calm and unwavering persistence is one of the most powerful forces I've witnessed. When Max decided as a toddler he preferred sometimes to walk by himself rather than be strollered, Brian obliged, slowing down both our natural rhythms in the world dramatically. I believe this unwavering persistence is something that exists in all elements of Brian. Brian reads and reads and reads. This is something he's said about that. It's partly just trying to stay curious. I read a couple hundred books a year, but there are so many gaps, so many things I should read. I'll probably still be feeling that way when I die. Brian translates. This is what he said about that. As a writer, I find translating incredibly useful. The act of translation teaches me how to put language together in a way I don't usually. It's a very intimate engagement with someone else's way of constructing language and the most intense way I know of dealing with the deliverance of thought into language effectively. Circling back to a previous topic, Brian likes animals. He's even fed a porcupine. Brian's favorite bird is the secretary bird, and he took this picture himself at the San Diego Zoo. Brian jumps higher than fascists. Brian hikes. Brian castles. Brian kayaks. Brian concerts, usually arriving quite early. Brian museums. Sometimes while museuming, Brian theremins. Brian is a beast. Our friends could have waited for AAA, but why do that when you could pop the clutch with Brian? So the next thing I read is one of my favorite things that Brian says about how his mind works. The photo doesn't really go with it. It's just a photo I like. Brian. I once had the experience of walking across a parking lot and seeing what I thought was a bird moving very strangely on the other side. I thought, oh, it's injured or trying to protect its young. I came closer, but it wasn't until I was 10 or 15 feet away that I realized that this was not a bird at all, but a leaf being blown around in the wind. That slippery space of what we perceive as real and what gets imagined, Brian dwells there. He owns it. And when I read him, he never lets me forget it. Before I knew how to structure this introduction, I wrote to Brian's friend, Forrest Gander, who was a colleague of his at Brown University. He's a translator, novelist, poet, probably most known as a poet because he won the Pulitzer Prize for that. And I asked him what he'd say about Brian, and he sent me this email. At the country's third largest book fair, I asked two of the so-called horror writers if they read Brian Evenson. Their faces lift like twin moons, and the first says, as though in a trance, he's the one. The second, it doesn't get better. So I know I'm only part of that large company who considers Brian Evenson one of the most virtuosic writers of his generation, and certainly one of the most versatile. However unblinking Evenson may be with regard to his subject matter, his genius is most obvious as style. His astonishing lexicon and diction, alternately baroque and minimal in a modernist melange, and his syntactical flexibility reach back towards 17th century writers like Thomas Browne and Robert Burton. His stories and novels mostly bypass the backwater eddies where many contemporary prose writers develop character and historical context. Instead, Evenson's stories rush headlong from highly lyrically pitched event to highly pitched event, lavishing their energy on pulsating lyric sentences, and sometimes depict scenes of astonishing violence, a violence that is undercut by the flatly neutral tone and the lack of interpretive narration or context, and by dark hilarity. He is the one. He has all the talents. Brian Evenson makes things. Many, many interesting things. And I give you Brian Evenson.
So it's a little hard to follow that up. Thanks, Kristen, for the introduction. I don't think we want that exactly. Let me see what I can do here. We'll just leave that up for a minute, and I'll get to it in a minute. Thanks so much for that introduction. Kristen kept secret what she was doing and what she was going to say, and kept saying things like, I don't think it's going to embarrass you, which means that I've been nervous for the past few days. If you don't know Kristen, she's a varied, inventive, and incredibly capable writer and a force for good, and I'd encourage you to get to know her. In addition to what Dan said about her, I'll just say that she's published excellent books in nearly every genre that I don't cover, and in addition can also hold her own in most of the genres that I do write in. I've joked at times that if she and I were alone on a desert island, we could recreate almost all of literature. Though since we've spent so much more time writing than working on our survival skills, I don't know how long we'd last. I say that, but in fact, Kristen has thought extensively about things like how to survive a bear attack and how to survive at sea if you're in a life raft surrounded by sharks. So maybe we'd be okay after all, but thanks to her rather than thanks to me. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about the project I've been working on here, and then I'm going to read some fiction. Not from that project, but from earlier work to give you some sense of what I do and how I think, and to give you the feel of my work, how it engages with sensation and affect and empathy. I'm also going to do it, since I know there's some people who, some people's English here is better than others, I'm going to show a text so you can follow along if you want to or need to. I'm trained as a theorist, but I'm not going to be very theoretical about this, largely because I feel there's so much that's intuitive about fiction writing, at least the fiction of the sort that I write. But I want to first say how grateful I am to Mary Ellen von der Heyden for the fellowship that I'm on while at the American Academy. The gift of time is incredibly important to a writer. Having time away from teaching, time to focus on a larger project is invaluable. In addition, I'm grateful to my fellow fellows and partners and their children who have made this such a welcoming community for me and my family. And I appreciate that tremendously. And I appreciate as well the staff here who have just been so supportive of us in so many ways and also feed us all the time. So my project is tentatively called Handbook for a Future Revolution. It's a project that I've been thinking about for a long time, since George W. Bush was president, which was a little while ago. In 2004, I read a short novel by Nicholson Baker called Checkpoint. In it, two old friends, Jay and Ben, have a conversation in a hotel room in which Jay, down on his luck and depressed, insists that he wants to assassinate President Bush. Ben tries to talk him out of it, though the main reason he gives is that since Dick Cheney will still be around, things will be even worse once Bush is gone. The novel is written like a transcription of a recording, and it ends before we know if Ben has managed to talk Jay out of attempting to assassinate Bush. That book voiced frustrations a lot of us were having about Bush and the war in Iraq, but something nagged at me about it, and it took me a little while to figure out what exactly it was. I came to feel that neither of the two characters felt like people. The closer I looked at them, the more they felt like straw men, each embodied a pre-articulated political position, and their conversation operated primarily on a symbolic register. I have nothing against the symbolic per se, but I do find it suspect when something that is symbolic claims to be mimetic. I grew up in Utah in a culture that was largely conservative, but had a lot of weird pockets. Fundamentalist Mormons, libertarians, survivalists, polygamists, people who believe they communicate directly with God, etc. My sense was that, first, the reasons Baker's book gave for wanting to assassinate Bush were not the reasons that people that I had grown up around would have given. And second, that if they were attempting something like that, they wouldn't talk about it, they'd just do it. A lot of my work begins that way, reading or viewing something and picking at a thread until it begins to unfurl in my imagination to become something else. How would Baker's basic notion work differently if that desire to violently remove a leader originated within the Mormon subculture that I'd grown up in? How would they justify it? I became increasingly interested, too, in the idea of someone who had been in that culture and who understood the values and attitudes of it, but was now outside of it, feeling like he was watching something disastrous happening, but was powerless to stop it. Maybe the reason for that was that I was leaving the Mormon church, but most of my extended family was still Mormon at the time. And so I felt when I was talking to my extended family, as I was often having, that I was often having to pretend to be a past self that I no longer was. It made me acutely aware of how different the Mormon world was from the world of the larger United States, even though the differences were often not obvious at first glance. But the thing is that since my mother and father were staunch Democrats, my father was actually the head of the Democratic Party in Utah, which may be the most thankless job ever. Something atypical among Mormons, I was never that past self that I was pretending to be with other more conservative family members and friends. It had always been an illusion. I grew up feeling there was a gap between who I was and who most of the people around me were, and also a gap, too, in terms of who I was and who these people believed me to be. Growing up, I thought I must be more like people living outside of Utah in the larger United States. But once I was living outside of Utah, I found that this both was and wasn't true at the same time. A few nights ago, Kristen told me that when she was growing up Mormon in Idaho, we're both former Mormons, so jackpot, she felt like she didn't fit, that she didn't belong in Mormonism, that she belonged outside of Mormonism in America. But then once she was out, she began to realize that maybe she wasn't all that much better a fit for large swaths of America either. She's talked before, and some of you have heard this, about hearing the Mormon Joseph Smith story as a kid, about how Joseph Smith was led by the angel Moroni to the golden plates that were the Book of Mormon, and then was given magical stones that allowed him to translate them. It sounded so improbable to her that she just assumed that nobody really believed it, that everybody was just pretending. She was shocked when she realized people actually did believe it. I felt something like that, too, when I was serving a Mormon mission in France back in the late 1980s. I loved France, but did not love being a missionary. It didn't make sense to me that anyone could seriously believe Mormon culture was preferable to French culture. And the longer I was there, the less sense it made. Going door to door and talking about the religion, I felt like I was pretending. I wasn't all that good at pretending, which meant mercifully that my conversion rate was very low. But despite not being good at pretending, I stayed in Mormonism for another decade and a half until finally I was excommunicated over my work. A few weeks after I read Baker's Checkpoint, I got a fellowship to go live at the Camargo Foundation in the south of France. I quickly found I felt more connected to certain European attitudes and ideals than I did to American ones. So in addition to the tension between Mormonism and America within me, there began to be a tension between America and Europe. That's something that Kristen and I ponder frequently as we think about what it will be like to eventually go back to America. If you never quite fit in, where is home for you? I grew up with my grandfather telling me about how, when he was a Mormon missionary in Germany in the 1930s, he saw Hitler speak. He found Hitler and the reaction that people had to him terrifying and imbued me with a healthy mistrust of fascism. At the same time, he had a real appreciation for German music and culture. Most of his cultural life was located there, despite the fact that he lived in Hawaii. He was a weatherman for the Navy. He was, in fact, the head weatherman for the Pacific during the Battle of Midway and was based in Hawaii during that time and then moved back there later. So when I was 6 or 7, I grew up thinking that it was completely normal to listen to Wagner while wearing a Hawaiian shirt, that was how one listened to Wagner. There's a lot of complexity in how one interacts with all the different cultures that form you and subcultures that form you. So much so that two people can be in the same room experiencing the same event and have entirely different experiences. And the story I'm about to read in a moment hopefully touches on this. When I was living at the Camargo Foundation for the semester, my father called to tell me that they had determined that my cousin Sean was schizophrenic. He'd been taking long walks, hours long, and collecting pieces of scrap metal from the side of the road, hubcaps, cans, etc., anything metal. At first, he didn't know what to do with this scrap, but as he collected more and more of it, the act began to feel significant to him. He bought a safe and filled it with scrap metal. Then he bought another safe and filled that as well. Then he bought a third safe. Eventually, a neighbor noticed something weird was going on, and when he tried gently to talk to my cousin about why he had 3 safes in his living room, Sean told him that he was building 3 bombs. The neighbor, understandably alarmed, called the police. Instead of the police, the FBI showed up. Sean refused to open the door, instead threatening to use his bombs. I was very lucky not to be killed. They arrested him, broke down the door, arrested him, demanded he open the safes. He refused. Eventually, they took the safes out into a field and blew them open and discovered they just contained tangled metal, not bomb parts at all. For a moment, it looked like he might be charged as a terrorist, the scrap metal being defined by some people as potential bomb parts. But in the end, he was institutionalized. So those are some of the pieces that began to coalesce for me into an idea for a novel. Assassination rhetoric, the weird pockets of Utah culture, the sense of dislocation within and between cultures, collision between Mormonism and America and Europe, and mental illness in the way cultures do or don't treat it. I was working on all that when Bush's presidency came to an end because Obama was elected. Suddenly, it felt more like a historical project than one responding to a particular moment. And so, busy with teaching and struggling to find psychic space to work on a long and complex project, I let it go for a while, writing mostly short stories instead. When Trump was elected, I began to think about it again and even made some progress in rethinking it. But again, there was the difficulty while teaching of finding mental space to work on it. By the time the pandemic began, I wasn't sure I would return to the project. But then in 2024, I began to increasingly feel that Trump would be reelected. And so, almost as a form of therapy, I began working on the novel, hoping in an act of magical thinking that if I spent enough time on it, Trump wouldn't be elected. You can see how well that worked out. Now I'm in the thick of it, hoping to have a draft finished by the time I finish my residency. Watching the national disaster that's America from a distance from Germany gives me a different sort of perspective on what I'm writing. At the same time, I'm not going to read from the novel tonight, both because I've been constantly rethinking what I'm writing since America has changed in almost unimaginable ways since I've been in Germany, unless, in fact, America has simply revealed more overtly what it has long been, and because I think it might not be the smartest idea at this particular juncture, if I have to go back to America, to read in a recorded format from a novel that thinks seriously about the collision of madness and regime change. If you're living in America now, I imagine, I don't know for certain since I'm not living in America, that you still feel like you are, despite everything that's going on, American. If, like me, you've been living outside of America since late December, there's a process of intense alienation that's going on and that continues. Viewed from the outside, it feels like America is going through a moment of what Guy Adams and Danny Balfour have called administrative evil, by which they mean a governmental structure that has begun to act sociopathically, largely due to a lack of empathy at the head of the structure. Seemingly ordinary people go along with it because they, quote, may simply be acting appropriately to their organizational role, just doing what is expected of them while participating in what a critical observer would call evil. Ordinary people can engage in acts of administrative evil while believing that what they are doing is not only procedurally correct, but in fact, good. This is obviously something Germany went through and has, in the intervening years, spent a lot of serious time confronting. How the United States will confront the same challenge remains to be seen. So considering where we are at this particular juncture, I'm not going to read from Handbook for a Future Revolution, but I'm going to follow the route that many 20th century Eastern European writers took and speak at a slant. I think that's key to understand in terms of the relation of my fiction to whatever reality it touches on. I'm less interested in approaching things as they are than I am in trying to capture a certain kind of mode or intensity or a feeling that strikes me as being connected to the situation. I think of it kind of as like making a circuit and bringing a certain charge from one place to another place, but still maintaining the charge. So for the remainder of my time, I'm going to read a story, which can give you a sense of how I deal with seemingly real situations and how the fantastical tends to creep into those situations for me. I'm really not interested in depicting the real so much as I am into depicting how someone's experience transforms the real. And then we'll have questions after if you are still awake. So, all right, so I'm going to read a story called Younger, and I'll just jump right into it. Years later, she was still calling her sister, trying to understand what exactly had happened. It still made no sense to her, but her sister, older, couldn't help. Her sister had completely forgotten, or would have if the younger sister wasn't always reminding her. The younger sister imagined each time she talked to her sibling on the telephone, each time she brought the incident up, her older sister pressing her palm against her forehead as she waited for her to say what she had to say, so that she, the older sister, the only one of the sisters with a family of her own, could politely sidestep her inquiries and go back to living her life. Her older sister had always managed to do that, to nimbly sidestep anything that came her way so as to simply go on with her life. For years, the younger sister had envied this, watching from farther and farther behind as her older sister sashayed past those events that an instant later struck the younger sister head on and almost destroyed her. The younger sister was always being almost destroyed by events and then had to spend months desperately piecing herself together enough so that when once again she was struck head on, she would only be almost destroyed rather than utterly and completely destroyed. As her mother had once suggested, the younger sister felt things more intensely than anyone else. At the time, very young, the younger sister had seen this as a mark of emotional superiority, but later she saw it for what it was, a serious defect that kept her from living her life. Indeed, as the younger sister reached first her teens and then her 20s, she came to realize that the people who felt things as intensely as she were either institutionalized or dead. This realization was at least in part due to her father having belonged to the first category, institutionalized, and her mother to the second, dead by suicide. Two more facts that her older sister, gliding effortlessly and quite frankly mercilessly through life, had also sidestepped. Indeed, while the younger sister was realizing to a more and more horrifying degree how she was inescapably both her mother's and her father's child, her older sister had gone on to start a family of her own. It was like her older sister had been part of a different family. The younger sister could never start a family of her own, not because, as everyone claims, she was irresponsible, but because she knew it just brought her one step closer to ending up like her mother and father. It was not that she was irresponsible, but only that she was terrified of ending up mad or dead. The incident had occurred when their parents were still around, before they were, in the case of the mother, dead, and in the case of the father, mad. There were, it had to be admitted in retrospect, signs that things had gone wrong with the parents. Things her older sister must have absorbed and quietly processed over time, but which the younger sister was forced to process too late and all at once. The incident, the younger sister felt, was the start of her losing her hold on her life. Even years later, she continued to feel that if she could only understand exactly what had happened, what it all meant, she would see what had gone wrong and could correct it, could, like the older sister, muffle her feelings, begin to feel things less, and in the end, perhaps not feeling anything at all. Once she felt nothing, she thought, knowing full well how crazy it sounded, she could go on to have a happy life. But her older sister couldn't understand. To her older sister, what the younger sister referred to as the incident was nothing, less than nothing, really. As always, her older sister listened patiently on the other end of the line as the younger sister posed the same questions over again. "Do you remember the time we were trapped in the house?" she might begin. And there would be a long pause as her older sister, so the younger sister believed, steeled herself to go through it again. "We weren't trapped exactly," her older sister almost always responded. "No need to exaggerate." But that was not how the younger sister remembered it. How the younger sister remembered it was that they were trapped. Even the word trapped did not strike her as forceful enough. But her older sister, as always, saw it as her role to calm the younger sister down. The younger sister would make a statement, and then her older sister would qualify the statement, dampen it, smooth it over, nullify it. This, the younger sister had to admit, did calm her, did make her feel better momentarily, did make her think, maybe it isn't as bad as I remembered. But the long-term effect was not to make her feel calmer, but to make her feel insane, as if she were remembering things that hadn't actually happened. But if they hadn't happened the way she remembered, why was she still undone more than 20 years later? And as long as her sister was calming her, how was she ever to stop feeling undone? No, what she needed was not for her sister to calm her, not for her sister from the outset to tell her there was no need to exaggerate, but she could not figure out how to tell her sister this. Not because her older sister was unreasonable, but because she was all too reasonable. She sorted the world out rationally in a way that stripped it of all its power. Her older sister could not understand the effect of the incident on the younger sister because she, the older sister, had not let it have an effect on her. For instance, her older sister could not even begin to conceive how the younger sister saw the incident as the single most important and most devastating moment of her life. For her older sister, the incident had been nothing. How was it possible, her older sister wanted to know, that the incident had been more damaging for her than their mother's suicide or their father's mental collapse? It didn't make any sense. Well, yes, the younger sister was willing to admit it didn't make any sense, and yet she was still ruined by it, still undone. If I can understand exactly what happened, she would always tell her older sister, I'll understand where I went wrong. But nothing happened, her older sister said. Nothing. That's just it. And that was the whole problem. The sisters had played the same roles for so many years that they didn't know how to stop. Responding to each other in a different way was impossible. Every conversation had already been mapped out years in advance. At the moment, the younger sister was first forced to think of herself as the irresponsible one, and the older sister was first forced to be a calming force. They weren't getting anywhere, which meant that she, the younger sister, wasn't getting anywhere, was still wondering what, if anything, had happened, and what, if anything, she could do to free herself from it. What she thought had happened, the way she remembered it when, alone late at night, she lay in bed after another conversation with her sister, was this. Their mother had vanished sometime during the night. Why exactly, the younger sister didn't know. Their father, she remembered, had seemed harried, had taken their mother somewhere during the night and left her there, but had been waiting for them, seated on the couch when they woke up. He had neither slept nor bathed. His eyes were very red, and he hadn't shaved. Somehow, she remembered, her sister hadn't seemed surprised. Whether this was because the sister wasn't really surprised or because, as the calm one, she was never supposed to appear surprised, the younger sister couldn't say. She remembered the father insisting that nothing was wrong, but insisting almost simultaneously that he must leave right away. There was, the younger sister was certain, something very wrong. What exactly it had been, she was never quite certain. Something with the mother, certainly, perhaps her suicidal juggernaut just being set in motion. Though her older sister claimed that no, it must have been something minor, a simple parental dispute that led to their mother going to stay temporarily with her own mother. And the only reason the father had to leave, the older sister insisted, was that he had to go to work. He had a meeting, and so he had to leave them alone, even though they were perhaps too young, even the older sister had to admit this, to be left alone. Her older sister claimed, too, that the father had bathed and looked refreshed and was in no way harried. But this, the younger sister was certain, was a lie, just the older sister's attempt to calm her. No, the father had looked terrible, was harried and even panicked. The younger sister wasn't exaggerating, not really. Do you love me? The younger sister sometimes had to say into the phone. Do you love me? She would say. Then stop making me feel crazy and just listen. So there was her father in her head, simultaneously sleepless and well-rested, clean and sticky with sweat. He had to leave, he had explained to them. He was sorry, but he had to leave. But it was all right, he claimed. He set the stove timer to sound when it was time for them to go to school. When they heard the timer go off, he told them they had to go to school. Did they understand? Yes, both girls said they understood. And one more thing, the father said, his hand already reaching for the knob. Under no circumstances are you to answer the door. You are not to open the door to anyone. And after that, according to the older sister, nothing much. The father left. The sisters played together until the timer rang, and then they opened the door and went to school. But that was not how the younger sister remembered it. There was, first of all and above all, the strangeness of being alone in the house for the first time. There was a giddiness to that, a feeling they had stepped beyond the known world, a feeling the younger sister never for a moment forgot, a feeling which made it seem like not just minutes were going by, but hours. But it was just a few minutes, her older sister insisted. Like hours, said the younger sister. Not actually hours, but like hours. All right, she conceded, not actual hours, though she knew that when it came down to it, there was no such thing as actual hours. But for all intents and purposes, she had already lost her sister, once again had rapidly reached a point where she could no longer rely on her sister to help her understand what exactly had happened. But she kept talking anyway, because once she had started talking, what could she do but keep on? The point was, time slowed down for the younger sister and never really sped back up again. There was a giddiness and a sense that anything could happen, anything at all. There were only two rules. The world would end when the timer rang, and under no circumstances were they to answer the door. But within those constraints, anything could happen. What did they play? They played the same things they had always played, but the games were different too, just as the girls alone had become different. Her older sister, as always, went along with what the younger sister wanted to play, playing down to her level. But this time, anything could happen. The small toy Mustangs they played with dared do things they had never done before, cantering all the way across the parents' bedroom, where they gathered and conferred and at last decided on a stratagem for defeating the plastic bear, which, once bested, was flushed down the toilet and was gone forever. The two girls watched with sweaty faces and flushed cheeks as the bear disappeared. Anything could happen. The younger sister pulled herself up on the bathroom counter and opened the cabinet and used the mother's lipstick on her own lips, something she was never allowed to do, and then used the lipstick to paint red streaks on the horse's sides, bloodied from where they had been gashed by the bear in battle. The most injured Mustang limped slowly away and found a cave to hide in. He lay down inside it and hoped that the cool and the dark either would help him get better or would kill him. At first, the cave was just the space under the couch, but the Mustang wasn't getting better. So the younger sister stuck him in her armpit and called that a cave and held her arm clamped to her side. When later she reached him back out, the blood had smeared off all over inside the cave, and the horse was miraculously healed and allowed to return to the pack. It's not called a pack, her older sister told her over the telephone. It's a herd. But the younger sister knew that they had called it a pack, that anything could happen, and that pack was part of it too. They had known at the time it was a herd, but they had called it a pack, and they had said it wrong on purpose. They were building a whole world up around them, full of things more vivid and slippery than anything the real world could offer. Just because her older sister couldn't remember, didn't mean it hadn't happened. And the sisters had become Mustangs as well, had joined the pack as well. Couldn't she remember? They took the two biggest rubber bands they could find and stretched them from their mouths over the back of their heads like bridles. They took old plastic bread bags their mother had saved and filled the bottoms with paper napkins and rubber banded them to their legs and then slipped shoes over their hands. And suddenly it wasn't to pretend, but something was happening that had never happened before. Couldn't she remember? It was ecstatic and crazed and like they were fleeing their bodies. It was the only thing like a religious experience the younger sister had ever had, and she had had it when she was 6. And then suddenly it all went wrong. They heard the timer go off and ran to turn it off, but they were still wearing shoes on their hands, and neither of them wanted to take the shoes off. So they tried to stop the timer by trapping its stem between two shoes and turning it. But the timer stem was old and too smooth to turn like that. So while the timer buzzed on, the younger sister had neighed at her older sister, and together they had cantered to the dining room table and taken a chair, supporting it between them with their hooves, and brought it to the stove. The younger sister stood on it and leaned over the burner, feeling the enamel warm in one spot from the pilot light, and turned the timer off with her teeth by twisting her head. That was, the younger sister knew, the sign that the world had come to an end, that it was over, that now they had to go to school. Only it wasn't the end, for as soon as the timer was turned off, the doorbell rang. It froze both of them, and they stood there, bread bags on their feet and shoes on their hands, and kept very still and very quiet. They were not to answer the door. Their father had been very clear about that. But they were also supposed to go to school. How could you go to school when someone was at the door, ringing the doorbell, trying to come in? My older sister, the younger sister thought, will know what to do. But her older sister was standing there not doing anything. The doorbell rang again, and still they waited, the younger sister nervously rubbing her hooves together. They waited a while for the doorbell to ring a third time. When it did not, her older sister leaned close to her and whispered, "Come on." But they had taken only a few steps when they heard not ringing, but a hard, loud knock. 4 sharp, equally spaced blows right in a row. And that stopped them just as much as if someone had yanked back on their bridles. It was like that for hours, for what anyway seemed like hours. Her hands were getting sweaty in the shoes. Her feet in the bread bags were much, much worse. The napkins at the bottom of each bag had grown damp. Her mouth, too, hurt in the corners because of the rubber band. Her older sister took a few steps, and the younger sister, not knowing what else to do, followed. Her older sister, she saw, had taken the shoes off her hands without the younger sister noticing, and had gotten the rubber band out of her mouth and was now creeping very slowly past the door. The younger sister followed, trying not to look at the curtain-covered window beside the door, trying not to see the shadow of whatever was on the other side, but seeing enough to know that whatever it was big, and seeing, too, when the knocking started once again, the door shiver in its frame. In their bedroom, her sister helped her get the shoes off. They had been on long enough that they felt like they were still on, even once they had come off. The rubber band bridle got caught in her hair so that her sister had to snip it out with a scissor, which made the bridle snap and raised a red stripe of flesh across her cheekbone and almost made her cry. The rubber bands holding the plastic bags to her legs had left purple grooves on her calves, and her feet were hot and wet and itchy. She dried them off on a hand towel and put her shoes on while her older sister stood on a stool by the bedroom window and tried to see out. "He's still there," she said. "What is it?" asked the younger sister. "I don't know," said her older sister. "Who, you mean?" But the younger sister had meant not who, but what. She wanted to climb on the stool beside her sister and look out as well, but was too scared. "What do we do?" she asked. "Do?" said her sister. "Let's play until he's gone." So they had begun again, with the plastic horses again, only this time it was a slow negation of everything that had happened before. Before it had seemed like anything could happen. Now all the younger sister could think about was how they were trapped in the house, how they couldn't leave, how they were supposed to leave but couldn't. The Mustangs were just ordinary horses now and could no longer move their plastic legs, but simply stayed motionless as they were propelled meaninglessly across the floor. The bear was gone for good, and she and her sister weren't horses anymore, just two trapped girls. Everything was wrong. They were trapped in the house, and she knew they would always be trapped. The younger sister kept trying to play, but all she could do was cry. Her older sister was comforting her, telling her everything was fine, but the way she said it, it was clear nothing was fine. Everything was hell. "What is it?" she asked again. "He's probably not even there anymore," said her older sister. "I bet we can leave soon." And to be truthful, it probably was soon after that, though it didn't feel that way to the younger sister, that her older sister went back into the bedroom and climbed up on the stool again and looked out and said that it was safe now and everything was fine, and this time seemed to mean it. They gathered their books and their lunches and opened the front door and darted out. The whole street seemed deserted. The older sister, who hated to be late, made them both run to school, and the younger sister reached her class even before Mrs. Clark had finished calling roll. When you look at it that way, almost no time had actually passed. When you looked at it that way, as her older sister in fact had, really nothing had happened. Nothing at all had happened. But for the younger sister, there was less of her from there on out. Part of her was still wearing shoes on her hands and a rubber band in her mouth, and was somewhere, sides bloody, looking for her pack. And part of her was still there, motionless, trapped in the house, waiting for the door to shiver in its frame. She was still, years later, trying to figure out how to get back those parts of her. And what was left of her, she could hardly manage to do anything with at all. "So what do you want me to do?" her sister finally one day asked, her voice tinny through the telephone. "Play Mustangs with you again?" And then she laughed nervously. And yes, in fact, that was exactly what the younger sister wanted. Maybe it would do something. It was worth a try, yes. If her sister would only do that, perhaps something, anything could happen. But after so many years, so many telephone conversations, burning and reburning the same past through their minds, so many years of playing the same roles, how could she ask this of her sister? She knew her role enough to know she could never bring herself to ask this of her older sister, not in what seemed like a million years. Thank you. We have, I think there's a few minutes if people have questions. I'm more than happy to try to deflect them or answer them. Yeah. And there's at least one mic. There's several microphones, I think. There's at least one microphone. So any questions? we can also just go drink. Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about the narrator.
Yeah.
One point when the narrator says, "And to be honest,"
Mm-hmm.
comments, question.
Well, so I mean, I think the story like this is interesting. There's a way of telling a story where it's a first person story and it's being told from the perspective of one or the other of the sisters. And there's something about you know, if you're telling it as a third person story, it gives you this kind of fluidity and this kind of flexibility that you can play with it a little bit. And so, you know, it's a story that's very close to the perspective of the younger sister, but it's not completely in her perspective. And I think that allows these moments of distance, just having the third person voice there, that allows you to have a different experience with the story than you would if it was a first person story. And so there's these moments of commentary that you don't always know how to place. And that's one, again, that to be honest. But also, I mean, I think it's if it was a first person story, I feel like you would either feel like you were completely on the younger sister's side or completely opposed to the younger sister, depending on how irritating you found her voice. And there's something about that distance too that I hope kind of puts you in a state where you can enter into the experience and yeah. And then I think the other way to kind of create that, or the way I try to create that with a story like this, is the details. You try to find details that are resonant for you as a writer, and that will hopefully, some of them have resonance with certain readers. And it's interesting to read this in Germany because I think there's details like the stem of the stove timer that's a very American detail in terms of a particular type of stove that probably doesn't translate. But there are probably other things that do as well. So, yeah.
Thanks. That was great, Brian.
Thanks, Adam.
I was wondering, it takes quite a while before you begin to give an account of,
Yeah.
What happened. So we know early on that there's this radical difference in their perspective on some moment in time, and we've talked a fair amount at the Academy about French fiction and the the nouveau roman, and I was thinking about figures like Duras and Robbe-Grillet, and your narrative strategy. I mean, in fact, for a little while, I thought you'd never even get around to telling us what had happened.
Right.
So I'm wondering,
that's the other version of the story, which would just
so I
piss
thought,
everybody
could
off.
you talk a little bit about the impact of that work, and how you deploy those strategies?
Well, so I think one thing that readers do when they're reading something is they tend to anticipate out in front of the story. And with something like this, where you keep on talking about, there's this thing that's happened, you don't know what the thing is, that one sister, eventually, that one sister thinks it's important and the other doesn't. You kind of put the reader in a position where they keep on projecting out and thinking about what could this be. And I think that, some people's minds go to very difficult situations, and, abuse and other things like that. Other people's minds are just, kind of maybe going in different directions. But I think that by doing that, the process of putting the reader in the position where they have to feel like they're trying to complete something that can't be completed, hopefully brings you into the fiction itself in a different way. And there is something, I mean, when you talk about the nouveau roman, there's the thing that's interesting about a book like La Jalousie, the Robbe-Grillet book, is that there's moments where the details just seem almost impenetrable. And then, at least for me, when I'm reading it, there's moments when suddenly it just all comes together in a way that brings you into the work in a really intense way. And so I those are people I admire. There's obviously some strategies that are similar and some that are different. But I do think it's more a question of that deferral is something that is going to do something to the reader and allows the story to build itself in a different way. Yeah, it's a very different story if you find out the details very early on. So yeah.
Did you grow up with sisters?
I did grow up with sisters. I'm the oldest of 5, and I had 3 sisters.
Is there anything autobiographical?
There are some of the details of what we used to do in childhood are very much in that story. They're not things that my children have necessarily played, but it's things that my sister and I used to do. We used to do that, where we'd put shoes on our hands and pretend to be horses. Several of us did. And we also did the thing with the bread bags on our feet. So we apparently weren't allowed real toys. So those sorts of details are things I'm taking. But it's like I like to take those details and energize them and hopefully make them work for people who are not me. But there are other things. I mean, there's little things like the stove is very, very much a stove that I had in a house I used to live in. And it had this timer that it had a plastic handle on it that had become so worn down, it was really hard to turn the timer on and off. And all those details are things. It's really a question, as much of anything, is those don't have to be the details in the story, but anything that feels observed or lived, I think, helps to kind of bring the story together. Yeah.
Hi, just listening to it reminded me a little bit. Oh, yes, sure. Listening to it reminded me a little bit of Moments of the Monkey's Paw.
Oh, uh-huh.
Right? And
Yeah.
there's that element of sort of building from a seemingly benign situation. And I wonder sort of how you feel about, again, picking your narrative strategy, building that energy towards almost horror.
Yeah.
Right, would be horror, because really you're bringing the audience along to something. What is behind that door?
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah.
we never know what's behind the door.
Right,
and
right.
then the idea that they actually just go out and they go to school.
Yeah.
Right, in that area where there was this sort of whoever or whatever was behind that door.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that sort of building that energy that I felt very palpably by the end of it.
Right. Yeah, that's if you don't know that story, it's a story. It's the thing that the monkey paw wish comes from, where it's someone gets a monkey's paw that you can make wishes on, and it just all goes horribly wrong. It involves a loud knocking at the door, and it ends at a moment where you realize that something really terrible has happened. I mean, I think that the way I tend to think about what I do in terms of whether it's literary fiction or horror, I think there's aspects of both in what I do, is that I'm trying to put the reader in a position where they become involved enough in it that it's hard for them to pull away from it. Because I think that the response that we often have to horror is to kind of draw back or pull away from it. And there's something, if you can kind of approach it in an empathetic way, it's both more intense and more painful, but also like ultimately a lot more satisfying. And so trying to both ease the reader in. It's like a crab pot, it's like if you put the crabs in the pot and then you turn on the boiling water, they're less likely to try to get back out. And it's trying to bring the reader in a way that they feel like they're gaining something from the story. They feel like they're having an experience which is satisfying, and then making that experience more complicated. And hopefully, again, I mean, I'm not writing work that I don't want people to go away and think, "Oh, you tricked me." I want people to have an experience that they feel like they gain something from. But it's a more complicated experience, I think, than you initially think it's going to be.
It's the theme of the story, if you want to call it a theme, is just that you can be made insane by the fact that someone else's perception of reality is not the perception you have. I'm just wondering, when you come to write a story like this, what's the germ? Is it that feeling of insanity that you want to create, or is it some other germ?
It is trying to understand those the tensions that you often get within families. where, I said a moment ago, I was the oldest of 5, and, I can't tell you how many times we've talked about memories, and my sister, so I'm the oldest, and I have a sister who's just right below me, and she usually will say, no, that never happened, and so there's this kind of process of like negotiating and gaslighting and denial, and it's like, it's so funny, the things that you remember that other friends or other family members just don't. And the act of trying to get them to a point where they understand why you remember this and why it was intense for you and why you're still holding on to it. It's a really complicated process. You can often get them to it intellectually, but they still don't understand in a way, if that makes any sense. And so I think that's as much about as anything. It's just about trying to figure out these moments of how is it that we can be in the same situations and have such a different experience of reality? I was contacted on social media for my sins, and I was contacted I wrote to someone on their birthday and just wished them happy birthday, someone I'd known in high school who's become a psychologist. And he wrote back and he says, thank you. For years, I've been holding on to this time I said this thing to you. And I just wanted, I felt bad about it, and I just wanted to apologize. And I had no memory whatsoever of what it was. And in fact, talking about it now, I can't even remember what it was. So either it was so traumatic that I blocked it out the first time, and then the second time when he told me about it, or it was just nothing to me. And then for him, he's been holding on to this all the for years and years, for 40 years, and it's. So he's had an experience with something that he said to me that I didn't have. And constantly, I think we're going through this kind of negotiation of experience with people where one's own kind of experience of a situation is just so different than maybe other people in the room. So, and sometimes you recognize that at the time, sometimes you don't recognize it at all. Sometimes you recognize it well after the fact. And so my sister once, I'll tell you a story about my sister, and I hope she's not listening. But my sister and I were very conflictual growing up because we both had somewhat strong personalities. It was probably her fault, but still. And she, one time I went and I got some juice out of the fridge, and I was just going to pour it into a glass, and she said, "You're not going to drink that out of the pitcher, are you?" And because she said that, I drank it out of the pitcher, and she slapped me. She's never slapped me before, and knocked the pitcher down. It broke, and she doesn't remember that anymore. I remember it because I was so shocked, and I had to clean up the juice, and then my mom was upset that I'd broken the thing. But she has no memory of it. So. Or she maybe will tell me later that she does have a memory with it, and I was completely wrong about the way I described it. So, yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. That was a wonderful presentation. You made mention of a relative of yours, if I'm not mistaken, a cousin being diagnosed of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And then in your novel, the excerpt you read, you presented a father dying of or diagnosed of madness.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, at what point or how do you distinguish between this diagnosis called schizophrenia and madness?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where do you draw a line between the two?
Mm-hmm.
I've always wondered.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a very complicated question in many ways. So I have a novel called The Open Curtain, which is about a young kid in Utah who's going through kind of a version of dissociative identity disorder, and which is kind of akin to schizophrenia in some ways. I don't know. I mean, one thing about the way in which people think about madness and think about schizophrenia, there's a kind of clinical sense of how people describe it. Those clinical definitions of what makes someone schizophrenic do change over time in terms of how clinicians think about it. So there's a manual called the DSM, I think it's 5 at this point, maybe 6, which is the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. And it's a kind of resource for psychologists and psychoanalysts that try to think about, what does it mean if certain kinds of things are going on for a patient? Can we think about it as schizophrenia? Can we think about it as some paranoid, neurosis, other sorts of things? But one of the things that's happened over time is that at a certain point they introduced into the classification system the idea of borderline states. And suddenly everyone was being seen as borderline, and so those, and I think something that happens too, sometimes people begin to respond to what they think their diagnosis is, which is very complicated as well. I'm very fascinated with alternate states and what they mean or what they don't mean. One other thing that I find fascinating about the way in which it works in terms of diagnosis is that, at least in DSM-4, the previous one, you read all this stuff about different diagnoses, and then there's a moment where it says, but if the religion of the person suggests that they can see angels or they can see demons or whatever, then it perhaps doesn't qualify as, hallucinate, schizophrenia or whatever. And so it becomes, when you start to think about, and Mormonism is a culture in which people literally believe that you can talk to God and that you can get a response from God. And so what that does is, in Mormon culture, if someone has a mental illness, it's sometimes hard to tell where that begins and where that ends, and what it means exactly. So it's a very complicated question. There's something cultural about the way in which we think about diagnosis. There's something cultural about the way we think about, sanity versus madness. I mean, those are very problematic terms in a lot of ways, I think. And it's something that, a lot of my work tries to explore and think about. I don't feel like I have answers so much as I'm just trying to continue to explore it and think about it. So I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah. We might have time for one or two more questions.
I was wondering if your experience as a young person, Mormon missionary in France, maybe sensitized you to this idea of two people experiencing the same thing, but in dramatically different ways.
Yeah.
And how, even this experience here in Berlin or being an expat, you just see things through your own culture.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that for me as a writer, it's been incredibly important for me both to learn different languages. I as you know from Kristen's introduction, I translate from French and was pretty involved and lived in France a couple of times. And the thing that's so interesting to me, if you're living in a culture and get very, are there for a while, then you begin to hold your body differently. You hold your mouth differently as well, and so you really kind of reach a point where you feel like you're in some ways a different person. Not entirely. You're never completely a different person, but there's French Brian, and then there's Brian in Utah. When I go back to Utah, my accent changes in the way I speak, and it's almost unconscious. Or when I come to Germany, I'm sure there's things I do here. One thing is that anytime I see someone on the street, I say, hello, which, I do it without even thinking about it. So all those things, I think, kind of make you conscious of the way in which, you at different moments, you both are and are not the same person. And there's something really interesting about that to me. And there's something about the thing I found is I'm much more capable of writing about places if I'm not living in them. Whether it's a specific town or whether it's a specific state or whether it's a specific country. There's something about having experienced them and then being able to remove from them that allows me, a little bit of a different perspective. And I think, for a writer, I think that's really, really useful. And I do find, for me, the act of translation is very important because it really does rewire your brain a little bit. I've learned how to formulate sentences from writers I admire who I'm translating and trying to figure out how their sentences will work in English that I wouldn't have written originally. But, as you're kind of engaged very deeply with language, you see different things about it. So, yeah. We there? Last one, or are we going to go? Yeah. One in the back there. Oh, and Abhishek too. We'll do two more if you want.
I would love to know if you can share any details on your cousin Treasury with us.
I can maybe share a few details about him. So yeah, he if he has his medication, he's fine. If he does not have his medication, then it gets a little tricky. His father is no longer alive, my cousin's father. At a certain point, my father, I mentioned he called me when I was in France when this was going on. My father kind of took over, just looking out for him and, trying to do what he could for him. And that was a complicated process. But yeah, I think that, I think that, schizophrenia, if you can take your medication and you are, sometimes medications don't work forever. So you have to kind of figure that out. It's something you can completely live with. But it's not always easy. But he's doing okay. He's doing all right for the moment. He hasn't bought any safes lately. So I think Abhishek had a question, and then maybe we'll go have a drink.
Thank you, Brian. So this was very interesting to hear you read the story. So I have a question for you about the effect that the story produces, right? So the effect of the story seems to come from what you describe as the kind of indeterminate position of the narrator, which raises problems around questions of empathy. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that which is a term that you have deployed.
Yes, I have.
Yeah. And so thinking in that framework, in that sense, what the story seems to do is it produces a kind of profound sense of discomfort in the reader, right? And the discomfort derives precisely from the inability to empathize or feel empathized with. That seems to be sort of the literary effect of the story that works very, very sharply. Now, so that's the sort of literary effect. Now, in the real world, I think everybody in this room has had some experience with precisely the kind of sensation that you describe here. So in a sense, the discomfort that you evoke in a literary form is something that we have experienced, all of us, in a personal form. And I'm trying to understand what the relationship is that you are trying to create between the literary form in the story and then the kind of personal form that you happen to know is actually completely widespread, will be shared by all of your readership.
Well, so one way to look at it is that the story almost serves as a catalyst to activate something in readers. And there's the assumption that all the people who are listening or reading have had something that they can connect to that is analogous, maybe different in some ways, but, we all go through something that's not unlike this. And so I feel like that's part of it, is just if we see the story as something that's kind of a catalyst or kind of creating an intensity or something, it's that's something that's there. And in that sense, it doesn't, the story matters less than the response to it. So it's very much, it's a story about having an experience in some ways. And I would imagine that at least some people in the room, it's like you do, as you're hearing this, you start thinking about your own experiences. I'm going to shift the question just a little bit, and I'll try to come back to it, but I'll probably forget. But one of the things that happens when I have students who come to me who want to write what they think of as horror is they have the idea that, oh, I really want to scare people. And that's kind of how they think about it. It's like, ah, and that's not useful. I mean, I think that for horror, at least what kind of horror I do to work, you have to be willing to engage yourself very deeply in it. So it's not so much you're scaring your reader as you're figuring out how to tap into your own fears in some ways and tap into them in a way that people can start to share them. And so, I guess I would say that each of these stories, a lot of the stories, and I think this is actually something a lot of my stories do, is they create what I would term more a kind of a feeling of dread. And the dread is something that grows and grows, and sometimes the story ends before it dissipates, and so that you're left in a place where you have to figure out how to cope with that. And so in many ways, I mean, stylistically, the way the arcs of my stories, and this is partly because when I was a kid, I hated Freytag's pyramid. And so I go to class and they would say, all right, we're going to do Freytag's pyramid. So you have rising action, have the climax, and then you have the denouement. And I kept thinking, why do I have to have the denouement? Can't we just end when it? And so the idea being that, if you end at a certain place, then the story keeps on working in your head. So, I mean, this story ends, there's a little bit of a resolution, but the resolution is there's no resolution. And so you're kind of left trapped in the same place that she's trapped. So I kind of feel like I'm talking around your question without actually answering it. But I do feel like I'm not really interested in conveying information so much in trying to have the story serve as a catalyst for experience, I guess is what I would say ultimately. So, yeah. So thank you so much.